So we're in this super cool garage with many really cool Fords, but I think my favorite is definitely the original Ford GT. One of the first things that really stuck out to me on this car is these louvers in the hood, because you just don't see those on GT40s hardly at all, and that's because this is the only car that was made with them. This was the first street car that was released to the public, and it was the only one that was fitted with these louvers. All the ones after this, those were removed and eliminated, and they had them more like the race car. So it really kind of makes it stand out and makes it super unique. And the other thing that's really noticeable is this killer British racing green color on it. Most of these things that you see are, you know, super flashy color schemes like Gulf livery, things like that. This just understated British racing green color looks so cool on the car. It really makes it have kind of a neat elegance to it. So one of the most famous, iconic, and coolest parts of the GT40s was the exhaust that's on them. It is super unique. It was called the Bundle of Snakes, and when you look at it, you could totally see why, but it led to one of the coolest sounding cars ever. Like, trying to do this on a front engine car would have been a total nightmare, but packaging it on the mid-engine car is quite a bit easier, even though it is still super complex. But it's really neat to see how they fabbed everything back in the day, and they've got these really large CLR bends and everything for really good flow, which is super neat to see. Another really neat feature that you'll see from the race cars is they had these boxes, like baffle boxes, on top of the valve covers to try to keep it from having oil misting issues. So it's a really neat way to cut down on the oil just coming out of the breathers and making a mess, and running the oil level low on a car that's got to run for 24 hours straight back in the 60s. So really neat stuff. If you look at some of the suspension, it's a really interesting rear suspension. I didn't know that these things ran a trailing link style upper control arm, but if you look, the upper control arm, the front mounting point of the upper control arm is actually like way up here, and the rear is back here, kind of in line with the half shaft. So it's really neat. And then it's got a similar setup, kind of like you'd see on an old Corvette or a Jag or something, where you've kind of got the trailing links that are kind of controlling, the rear caster, and then you've got a lower arm with another trailing link. Very cool rear suspension, interesting geometry. It's cool to see where things were in the 60s when we spend so much time looking at, race cars today and what we're doing, because we kind of try to apply that stuff into the car builds that we do today. It's really cool to see where they came from and kind of analyze some of this stuff. So one of the things that just really stands out to me too is these old electric fuel pumps. So obviously the race car, they ran electric pumps. These are super interesting. I haven't seen them before. It might be a really common pump from the 60s in race cars, probably is, but it's not something that I'm familiar with, and it's a very cool setup. A lot of, AN plumbing. Some of the stuff has been kind of upgraded to more modern stuff, because this car actually was raced in the recent past, and some of that stuff just had to get upgraded just for safety purposes. But it's really neat to see the dual pumps kind of from the dual tanks, and then they run right up here in a glass bowl filter that's super neat. See a lot of safety wire on it, which is kind of cool. It definitely gives you the vibe of the vintage race / aircraft, where everything is safety wired so that it can't come loose. The battery box obviously kind of hanging out back here. If you notice, one of the big concerns with this car, and you can really see it when looking at it in person, is that they were trying to keep the center of mass really, really low. So everything in the car has been dropped all the way to the ground. The fuel tanks are as low as they can be, and with the saddle tanks. Battery is really low. Engine is slung really, really low. You know, everything in it, just to try to get where, honestly, the tire is pretty much the high point of anything. So there's nothing of any sort of weight higher than the top of the tire. It is kind of interesting to see how tiny the rear sway bar is. Definitely not a whole lot of rear roll stiffness in this car, which is pretty interesting. The other thing that's pretty cool, if you look in here, in that shock, so we run a lot of JRI shocks, and they use an adjuster today that is very similar to this adjuster. So I believe these are original style shocks. I don't know for sure, but I think it's really cool to see that the shock adjuster on this thing is basically still getting used 60 years later. So that's kind of neat technology. So another interesting thing that I've found cool is that it is all fiberglass, and it's chop strand, which is cool. I was kind of curious if it might have been cloth. I guess I don't know my history quite well enough with race cars to know when cloth started to be used, but this is definitely chop strand. It's made pretty darn well. It looks like it's a pretty neat and tidy job. You could see some repairs in the past with some cloth was added to it, probably for strength. I mean, over the years they get damaged, so cool to see the old composite stuff. So the most striking thing when you first look at the interior of this thing is, you know, just how big the saddle tanks are, and that you can actually see the sending units for the fuel tanks when you open the door. It's kind of wild. A really neat feature is that it's a right-hand drive with right-hand shift, which is super unusual. Most cars that you drive that are right-hand drive, the shifter's on your left hand, and this one's on your right. It makes it kind of interesting getting in and out. And it's kind of got an interesting gait to it as well. First gear is actually down and back to the left instead of forward to the left like we're typically used to. And I guess it's kind of like the Ferrari, you know, I guess like a 308, something like that. And it has this really neat feature with the reverse lockout is just a little spring-loaded gate blocker, where when you want to put it in reverse, you just flip this forward, and then the shifter goes easily over and forward into reverse. And then when you want to lock it out, you just put the gate block down, and it makes it easier to go on the 1-2 shift without risking putting it in reverse. So that's super neat. So the instrument panel is super neat. A lot of the switches really remind me of vintage aircraft. I think it's kind of an ongoing theme here, is that because it is a vintage race car, it kind of had a little bit of aircraft technology in it. It's got quite a few more gauges than you'd see in a typical road car. It's pretty neat because it actually has an oil temperature gauge on the dash, which I find super interesting. It's cool. The old Smith's gauges are definitely super cool, and the lettering or the labeling on the switches is like old school label maker and then just stuck on there, which is not the most elegant, but it sure enough is cool. You know, it's neat to see that it was very business oriented. You could see the collapsible style racing steering column in here with just a wheel on it. Quite simple, you know, just Spartan, nothing more than it needs to have. If you look down in here at the pedal box, it is a very early iteration of what you would see in a modern race car. It's got a balance bar pedal assembly, and it's all hydraulics. Actually, when I was starting the car a little bit ago, I had to take my shoes off because my big old foot with a shoe on it doesn't fit between the brake pedal and the side of the foot box to get on the throttle. So very tight foot box, but that's pretty common with mid-engine cars, especially small cars like this. So the tight foot box isn't really a surprise. So one thing that Cole noticed that's pretty cool is it looks like it has a trans tunnel in it, but that's actually chassis stiffening, I would assume. Can't tell for sure because it's underneath carpet, but any chassis that we build currently will put a rib down the middle of it because it adds a ton of stiffness. So I am 99.9% sure that if you open that up, there would be a brace that runs down the center of the car to add rigidity to the chassis, especially because they used a lot of the outboard area for fuel storage. So trying to pick up a little bit of stiffness, adding that center rib went a long way to doing it. The seats also are way reclined. If you look at how far back they're leaned compared to what you would see in a normal car, it's definitely significantly more reclined, but it has to be because if you look at me right now, I'm actually sitting on the ground and I'm sitting straight up, and my head is pretty much not going to fit in the roof with me sitting on the ground and straight up. So as you can imagine, you need to be quite reclined to fit in it and not hit your head. I was actually super shocked that I can actually sit in the car, and if I scrunch just enough, I can get the door shut. I thought there was going to be no way in the world that that was going to happen, but I can. I definitely am not claustrophobic, but it is tight enough that it's pushing even my boundaries when you're 6'5" trying to cram into one of these. But these have always been one of my favorite cars, and I absolutely had to try. So one thing that's super interesting to me, I would have completely pictured this car having 4-piston rear calipers on it, and I'm almost a tick shocked that it's running 2. They're very large pistons, so if you see, I haven't measured it obviously, but judging by this cover they have on the back and just the sheer size of the casting around the piston, I imagine that it's quite a large 2-piston caliper. So square area wise, I would say that it's probably on the level of what we would run on a lot of our modern cars, but with it just having the 2-piston, it's going to have a really small pad area. So looking at the history, especially when you watch the Ford versus Ferrari movie about how these things had brake issues, I wonder if a lot of that couldn't be attributed to, just trying to dissipate heat with such a small brake pad, So interesting stuff, just something that I picked up. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed getting to take a little bit of a deep dive into the GT40 street car. I certainly did. I've always loved these cars. I've never really been this close to an original. Definitely never sat in one and started it before, so that was bucket list. Very cool, gotta say. Big props, big thanks to my buddy Jack. If you guys like this kind of stuff, please mention it in the comments that you want to see more, and don't forget to like and subscribe.